Welcome all, everybody. My name is Mary Burley, and I'm the chief educator here at the Rockwell Museum. And we could not be more delighted that you're here with us today to welcome Frances Jetter, whose exhibit upstairs, Amalgam, has been really entrancing all of us since it opened in November. I'm just going to highlight a couple of upcoming events, and then Stephanie Plunkett, the curator of this exhibit, will introduce Frances. Stephanie and Frances have a multi-decade relationship, and the results of that long-standing friendship are in evidence in this exhibit. And so I think that's just a fun thing for everybody to know. In March, Juji Morales, who is also exhibited upstairs, she will be here March 14th and 15th. On the 14th, we're running a family workshop. On the 15th, a teacher training, which is sold out, and in the afternoon, a talk and book signing, much like today's format. And then in April 18th and 19th, James McMullen will be with us. He will give a master class on Saturday, and we'll do a talk and book signing on Sunday as well. If you're excited about art making or have friends who are, we have a series of drawing and also collage and linoleum cutting workshops through the spring. The linoleum cutting workshops are around the theme of what makes home to us. And May 2nd, we're bringing a steamroller on site to print all of the different linoleum cuttings that have been made here at the museum, but also by community groups across the Berkshires. So that will be a fun thing to look forward to. Also, March 13th, at the Mahawi Theater, we have a free event at 7 p.m., and that is a lovely collaboration with high school students who are embodying the artists in the exhibit above, in the Finding Home exhibit, with the artist's work behind them and interspersed with Berkshire immigrant stories. And then we'll have a community conversation about what belonging in the Berkshires means from the high school students' perspective. So we hope that you join us for that. It's the second annual collaboration with the Mahawi and high school students, and it will be a whole nother way to think about this exhibit. So with that, Stephanie, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see you. How many of you have had a chance to see Frances's originals upstairs? Okay, great. So many of you are going to know the story. As Mary mentioned, I have been extremely fortunate to know Frances for quite a few years now. Frances, believe it or not, was my teacher at the School of Visual Arts in an illustration class. And yes, Frances. And, Frances just awoken this tremendous interest in illustration in me, as I know she continues to do for many students through the years, because she still, of course, is a professor there. But I'd like to just give you a little background on her book project, Amalgam, and then a little background on Frances as an amazing creator herself. Frances Jetter's Amalgam is an illustrated history of the life and times of her immigrant labor unionist grandfather, who left Poland in 1911 when it was still part of the Russian Empire. After arriving at Ellis Island, he found work as a pocket maker in a New York garment factory and became a foot soldier in America's Army of Labor, spending his life fighting for a living wage. Her powerful limited edition artist's book, created as a series of large-scale linoleum cuts that tell her story, is titled Amalgam, and of course amalgam relates to the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union in New York, which some of you may be familiar with. The great thing is it's actually on view, her book is on view in its entirety, so you'll be able to see every single image that she produced, and it has actually taken almost, I think, a decade to produce this book, a real labor of love. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and surrounded by the loving immigrant family described in Amalgam, Frances Jetter is recognized for her illustrations, artist books, and drawings, inspired by the social and political issues that she cares deeply about. A graduate of Parsons School of Design, she's been creating creating thought-provoking images for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Village Voice, the Nation, the Progressive, and many, many more for quite a few years. In addition, she's worked for many noted publishers and is the recipient of prestigious fellowships from the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library and the New York Foundation for the Arts, among others. In addition to Amalgam, Frances's powerful artist books include Cry Uncle, a graphic response to man's inhumanity to man in Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo and Bagram, Streets of Booksellers, created in the aftermath of the al-Mutanabi street car bomb explosion in Baghdad, Skies, Eyes, Lies, Flies, a political survey spanning the years between World War II and the presidency of George W. Bush, and the Reagan-Bush years, assembled prior to the 1992 presidential election. The Library of Congress, Fogg Art Museum at Harvard University, Detroit Institute of Arts, and New York Public Library are just some of the places that hold collections of her art. As I mentioned, Frances is also a very gifted educator and has been teaching at the School of Visual Arts since 1979, when she was born. I'm excited today because Frances is going to speak both about her creative process and the process by which she came to produce Amalgam, but also her technical process, which is extremely complicated. If you've looked carefully at her prints, it's quite remarkable to think about how they were actually made. And I also want to just take a moment to welcome Frances's family, who are up here in the front row, so we're so glad you could come. Thank you. Yeah, welcome everybody, and Frances, thank you so much. And I think I got the wrong slide up for you. There we go, okay. Thank you.
So thank you, Stephanie, for this wonderful exhibit. It's been a thrill to have work here and to work with you on this and to know you. I'll tell you a little bit more about this project, which seems endless at this point and is on the way to being done. We still have to do the letterpress pages and assemble this very large book. At the same time, I want to see it really out in the world, not just in special collections libraries, which is a nice thing, but kind of hidden away. My feeling is always that my favorite thing is to make things, to be able to do what you want to do, to have it interfered with, not at all is the preference, and then to really have it out in the world in publications. But it's also such a pleasure to have work in a place like this that appreciates illustration. I'll tell you a little bit about this book. I started out with just a few family pictures and the idea of the family being workers in the garment factories and what happened with the union, but that was kind of part of the story. The truth is I was never much interested in my grandfather's union buddies and all these things connected with it, and they didn't bombard us with any of it other than, you know, getting bawled out for wearing clothes made in Italy and that kind of thing. So that would happen a lot, but after reading more and more about labor and what workers would go through and the unfairness of it all, I got very interested in it and wanted to even do articles that were published on it. So that became a very big deal for me. My grandfather was a tough family person, loving but tough. And my cousins, I'm so glad my cousins are here today, they knew him, even though the two cousins who are here are Jetters, and my grandfather's family were Goldsteins. They were always welcome in the houses and spent a lot of time with us, so that's a great thing. So this book is as much about my grandfather's houses, where we were all taken in and welcome and shoved together and had no privacy and the rest of the things that would go with it, and the good things that went with this, along with the family of garment workers who really didn't have it easy, who struggled, and especially later on when the industry was weakened. So it is definitely about the idea of what home is. I hadn't thought about it that much early on, but it's about that. It's about working in an industry that was once a really important and strong part of New York City, and that changing around. And it's also about a country. So Amalgam to me is the combination, the blend of different people and thoughts, the individual and the group that's in the union, where it's hard to get different voices together. Family, where often that occurs also, where it's about both. And the country, which is definitely, one hopes, trying to get different voices heard and together. So that's why ultimately I named the book Amalgam, for the amalgamated clothing workers and for all these other things that are amalgams. This piece came later than some of the other pieces. I'll show you some that were the earlier pieces here. But part of the ideas I had about this book, it was much smaller, and it just kept expanding exponentially until, finally, I think it came together, but it was all these different things that happened with it. I was interested in some history. This fellowship at the New York Public Library was a completely new thing for me, because I was teaching I'm teaching part-time anyway, because nobody at my school everybody's an adjunct. Nobody works there full-time. But I was teaching very little, and then they give you an office there, and they bring books to the office at the Coleman Center, and everybody else either is historian or a writer of fiction, and I was the only visual person there. But to have books delivered and to have this time to read and to get immersed in things, historian there was very helpful to me in separating me from what I thought about some historical events and showing me articles and things to correct, which messed up my manuscript a good deal. But, there were several things that happened like that. It was known that the Russian Empire was notorious for inducting 12-year-old Jewish children into the Russian army. And that was something that became a huge event and is written about all over the internet, and there are many books on this. Magda Tedder, who's historian, who teaches at a Catholic university but is really involved in writing about Jewish studies, told me that there's a lot of revision in the thinking about this. And Tsar Nicholas was probably a Jew hater, but the reason he inducted 12-year-old children was more to incorporate them into Russia and have them be Russian citizens and to disconnect them with their villages and families. So it wasn't all one thing. And she sent me reports on this. So I had to change my carefully written idea about escaping the draft, because this is what they did to 12-year-olds. His son was Alexander, and he was called the Tsar Liberator, and he stopped the draft of children. Also, the draft didn't extend to the Kingdom of Poland, but that was a whole other thing. So he stopped the draft of children, and he had better terms as far as the army, because they would draft Jewish children and other children who weren't part of the regular Russian Empire. At the age of 12, they would be sent to schools, and then at the age of 18, every male in Russia had to serve 25 years. So that's why it comes to, I think, 31 years. So that was discontinued, and the term of service was much less than was much shorter term than that. But along with that, the Tsar Liberator, Alexander, was killed with a bomb under his carriage. And two of the people who did it, I think, were Jewish, and they weren't observant or anything like that I know of. But of course, Jews were blamed for his death, and their pogroms followed. So that's part of the history down there. And then by the time my grandfather was leaving Poland, there were additional things, laws enacted against Jews, and more anti-Semitism was following that. So that's kind of some of the story there in the text. So a lot of carving. That's my grandfather in 1920. So obviously in that time period, there weren't a lot of photos around. As is the case with most of the people in this story, there are very few photos, and it means kind of putting together things and imagining what they look like at this age. So that's my husband posing as my grandfather. And there are a lot of pictures to pick the right one to get a good shadow there. That's a rough drawing. To me, the drawings are really important in capturing the feeling and the posture, the rest of the things that go on. And I can go through a couple of pads of paper just trying to get that right, because if the drawing doesn't work out, the whole thing doesn't work out. I think that technique covers a lot of things, covers up a lot of things, but I don't want that. I think that the emotional impact and the drawing and all that will convey it better, and then the rest of it is finishing up in a way that shows it. So these are some research photos. That was a young religious boy. And then Magda showed me much later propaganda poster. It was from the Soviet Union, and it showed somebody with a yarmulke on holding a pig, like this was what they were going to do to kind of rid Jewish people of their religious feelings. So anyways, I found this nice picture with this boy with his pig, and then put them together for the drawing for this. And that's the Tsar Liberator after he was killed. There was a lot of reference on that. And this was one of the pogroms. I think it was Kishinev, I'm not remembering. Those are some officers for reference. And that was another article about Bialystok. I think this was 1905. So, and that's kind of pieced together. That's the preliminary drawing. So here's my grandfather. I don't know what year he actually started to work in the factories as a pocket maker, but I kind of was believing that maybe that's where he started to notice the pockets around him. And these are words from the Billie Holiday song about empty pockets, even though the song had nothing to do with labor and pockets. It kind of worked out for me. Okay. Okay, some more photos. Some more prints that were made from some photos about Mama may have and Papa may have. The last one over there is taken very much from a Louis Hine photo, and he did a lot of photos of child laborers. And so this is a child taking home goods to work in a sweatshop at home, but I changed a number of things about it and changed the child's, face and other things, but it's very close to Louis Hine's photo. So that's God Bless the Child Who's Got His Own. And this is part of the process. This has been a long thing with working with a terrific printer who just tries to get the feeling out of the prints instead of just making a perfectly smooth print. And this other young man who has figured out how to get some of these things to work. So I had rubber stamps made of these words, but not so simple. It always sounds simple in my head, and then it turns out to be a nightmare of production. But to stamp these pieces of paper just so they're readable, And so this is done with a process of something called sheen collé and printmaking. The printmakers will know this, but these were the pockets that then go through the press on the linoleum block to make the prints. Now, these are pieces that I started to make at the library also. At the library, every day I passed pictures of Carnegie, who gave so much money and funded great libraries across the country. So I saw this picture, and I'd read this book called Meet You in Hell before that. So I started to think that it was going to be important to have a little bit of labor history in this for the background. So this was, I read books about the Triangle Fire and got these actual photos of the lock that was on the building there, and found out that Francis Perkins had passed by there, was on the corner when people were jumping off the roof to escape the flames after being locked in this building. And I saw pictures, she said that was the day the New Deal was born, when she saw this happening. That was one of the morning pictures that was taken from in the top part. Now, the bottom part are these two guys whose factory it was. One of them opened another factory. Now, they had gotten a slap on the wrist for what happened with all these deaths in the first one, and they were not ever supposed to put a lock on factory doors, and then the one who opened it did this again. So again, I think it was a $75 fine, something ridiculous. I'm not remembering it. So I left out the part about Carnegie and Meet You in Hell. So what happened is that the Homestead, the factory in the Homestead disaster, locked out workers. Frick was running the factory for Carnegie. And the workers were on strike just to get some reasonable situation, not to have their wages diminished. And Frick called in the Pinkertons. Carnegie was away in Europe, later Scotland. And Carnegie basically said, do whatever you have to do. And so people were killed. And then this led to the destruction of the union, and the steel company was sold for a fortune to Morgan. And later on, Carnegie said it's not worth a drop of human blood to have all this. And maybe, I don't know why he gave this money all to libraries and to many causes. And they were old men when Carnegie wrote to Frick and said to Frick, let's make amends, let's meet and make amends. And Frick said, yeah, we'll meet. I'll meet you in hell where we'll both be going. So I found this, I have this great paper that's sort of marbled and looks like fire. So I have a hell scene with Carnegie kind of looking down at Frick in hell, and then there's Rockwell and his labor disaster, and there's Ford and his labor disaster in that picture. So then I thought they all should have an inferno scene, all these history of labor things. So that's the second inferno scene, with something from Bosch in the background, some of the fire. Hey, so I left out the part about their citizenship, and then they were so thrilled to be citizens, my grandparents, in 1917. But then what happened was all these laws were enacted that further blocked different immigrant groups from coming in. And in 1924, there was one about Jews and Italians and Middle Easterners, and it was Asians before that. So it's a long history of that kind of thing. So what I wrote, and what I mean is that my grandfather really believed in democracy as much as possible in the factory, but at home he was an absolute tyrant. And the three children, my mother is the baby here, were not allowed to have toys. He took the toys and he shut them away where they couldn't be found. So that's how they grew up. And here, my mother told a story. she was 96 when she died. She still didn't stop regretting that she had no toys, and she had this paper doll from a newspaper supplement. And he said, "You're too old to play with dolls. You don't need this." And she let it fly out the trolley car window, and she never forgot that she let go of it. So that's this here. And that's the drawing. I like the drawing a lot better than I like the cut of her face, but, you know. This too, the older sister, Lillian, walked down the street with her friends, blocked the sidewalk. He thought this was really rude. He bribed her not to do it. She lost all her friends. So there are some of the stories. That's by Aunt Lillian on the right. And I kind of combined both of these pictures to get her in her teenage years. And found other reference of girls with linked arms from the time period. And something for the street. And this picture, my grandmother's sister, Yetta, and Yetta was passed off as the youngest sister, which she was not. She was probably 40 when my grandmother dragged her to a matchmaker. And the matchmaker's Yiddish-speaking parakeet said, "Was willen die alte Moinen? What do these old maids want?" So that's Aunt Yetta later on. I really love her face. And her. She's a little nutty, but really great. So there's a rough drawing, and there's the other one. And in Europe, the matchmakers were men, and I had to try to find somebody. She didn't exactly do, and then there's the birdcage, and that's me posing in that part. I had a couch from the right time period. So lots of pictures have gone into this. I have big files of everything. You know, I have 15 people for the matchmaker and all these bird cages and all that just to try to put it together. This is of May Day. The other sister, the beautiful sister, who was sent over to this country first because she had better prospects than poor Aunt Yetta. This sister met the man she later married at a May Day parade, and that workers all attended. So this is the May Day parade then. Now, these things, my mother told the story about the neighbors down the block in the Great Depression sharing one egg among all of them. You know, some really dubious stories, but, you know, they kind of made pictures in my head for so many years that this was easy to show. My grandfather was on fire escapes, climbing into shops where people worked 7 days a week, and did this. And when he came home, he checked the homework at night. Even though he didn't understand it, he would check it anyway. And then there's something that was in one of the Amalgamated Union books. These workers threw themselves in front of a truck delivering bootleg goods to factories and actually made it stop, which is quite amazing, I think, that this happened. And that was earlier, and then later on, I was reading books about Frances Perkins and what she did, which was so remarkable. And it's pretty surprising that maybe now people are talking more about her, but she was so important in thinking of things and getting people's rights. So she was responsible for Social Security and many other things that benefited workers. And they actually tried to they were thinking of getting health care past them, but they knew it wouldn't pass and it would defeat the other things they wanted done. So that didn't happen. And Sidney Hillman, who worked with her at times and before, and that wasn't kind of an easy thing for him, but he'd thought of many reforms much earlier on also, like in the 20s with the strike, and they showed Chaplin films. And he thought of some kind of unemployment insurance. It was very small, but it was something to think of what people would do when they were out on strike for sometimes many months. And he also set up a bank that would have loans to workers. many things that helped people's lives, and also these amalgamated apartments so workers could move out of the slums. Really remarkable person. So at the same time also there's FDR's song, Happy Days Are Here Again, playing on the phonograph. This is one of the pictures on the right-hand side. It was letters home. My grandmother would send packages and letters, and then when she stopped hearing, it was utter panic and thinking what went on with the family back in Europe. And these are sort of brief stories about the terrible things that happened in the war. They got married in 1911, and she came over in 1912. His city was very progressive and modern, and I think hers was less so. They had synagogue walls that were built really thick for a reason, and it's just really tragic story. There's the whole spread. On the left side is actually a letter from my uncle, written from Burma, and with the whole family gathered to hear that. This is after the war. My father's name was Joe. So I think that really fit. Happiness is just a thing called Joe, that song from Cabin in the Sky. They were introduced at a Valentine's Day party. She always said he was the handsomest man she ever met. And they looked so happy. This wasn't remotely their house. It was some house in the Bronx. And they looked like, oh, this is my house, you know. And then I thought, okay, make it like this cozy shell. That's not where they ended up. They ended up here with the rest of the family in 4 cramped apartments in a house my grandfather bought, where we always had open doors. So there is this quote from Walt Whitman, and, you know, believing in unhinging doors from their locks. And my grandfather took this in his own way about unhinging doors. So we didn't have any privacy. So I thought, you know, okay, here. And the basement was where the parties were held. It was not a finished basement exactly, very far from, but, you know, the ping pong table and my brother's train sets and everything were disassembled from my grandfather's constant parties. And he really invited people over continually, which was both good and bad. And we had this storage of a million things of food in the basement also, and clothes and other things. So here this is our family hinged. We were hinged to each other. And there's my dad. My dad would come home with the shears. The whole house would buzz with talk about the fact that he was unemployed when they saw him come home on the steps with his shears. And it happened around Christmas time because they didn't want to pay workers for the holidays, so they laid them off. So that was something that happened to people who were working. He was a cutter. At one time cutters were considered the elite in the industry. I don't think that in his working time it was really such an elitist thing to be a cutter. And my father, like, we always had to get pajamas for him. Even pajamas had to be perfectly matched, because that was, you know, he didn't want to be a cutter. He wanted to, like, work as an electrician, but the union was handed from fathers to sons, so that didn't happen. And it was just, he was so devastated, sometimes he would just sit in the chair for days when he didn't have work. So here is one of the reasons for the downfall of that union and other unions. First, there was something early on called the Yellow Dog Contract, where people had to sign that they would not join a union, and they'd give away all their rights just for employment. And that was outlawed in 1932 by Norris LaGuardia. Now, there was a lot of anti-union sentiment after World War II because workers started to strike after not having been on strike during the war. The son of Taft, Taft down there, and Hartley, joined by the young Nixon and McCarthy, of course. And Truman urged the veto of it, which didn't happen, so it passed in the Republican Congress. And here's the third Inferno scene. So there he is, and, you know. Somebody said yesterday that here's Elvis with some arms, that he carried arms. I don't know what else about Elvis was peculiar. But this picture has nothing to do with my book, but I was just looking up pictures of Nixon, and I thought it was very amusing. Okay, there is the demon himself. And there's Bartolomeo's, one of the Inferno scenes. And then there were pictures of Congress, of course, and all that. So that's the rough for it. That's the cut. The cuts are backwards. You carve backwards into linoleum so that when it goes with the press, it's forward again. And that's Ian, that's the paper behind some of the other things, and he's putting that together for the process of printing. And that's Justin pulling it off. You see the block on the press, and it's the reverse of it. And we've adhered these other papers with this kind of glue that gets released when it's printed. So we try out different papers. So this is my grandmother. And this involved searching for the perfect challah, which Zabar's had. Upstairs there was my uncle's sister, Theda. And this is about Theda. Theda had named herself, Theda came from Russia and had named herself after Theda Bara, so I heard. And her first husband was so charming. When he walked down the street, my mother said he would always walk on the outside of the street, the way a gentleman is supposed to walk. He was a gambler. He ended up dying at the stables where he bet. He bet on the horses, and he died alone at their stables, sick and alone. And her second husband had a candy store on Kings Highway in Brooklyn, and we loved him too. This is Uncle Irving. I didn't know Charlie. And Uncle Irving would bring home all this candy for us to take to my grandfather's bungalow. So there's Uncle Irv. And that's the first husband, Charlie. He looks like he was a sensitive and beautiful man. And that's Theda. And here's somebody being, this is walking etiquette, I think is the name of this picture. Now, I just wanted the walking along the curbside to feel like a giant fall into an abyss. So I was looking at pictures of somebody higher up, ready to fall off the curb. So I don't know if it came through in the picture, but that's what the aim was after looking at these curbs. And that's Uncle Irving. There were no other pictures, so it's kind of, would have been easier to. Got this big bag of candy from Economy Candy, these old candies. And he always smoked also, so Chesterfield candy cigarettes. And we took these to the bungalow, my grandfather's bungalow, which my cousins remember was packed to the gills with family members. So this is one of my mother's old girdles that served for the house. And that's the finished print. It's in 2 pages. So they did a lot of work. The people in that house, my mother and my aunts, and also, they were constantly shopping and cooking for all the guests that came by, since my grandfather loved to have guests so much. And the men in the house, after, they worked a whole week, also were put to work continually in that house. So every once in a while, they took a break and got to this place called White's. And what I remember most about it was that it was covered with bugs on the outside. So this is part of this process here, where Ian made this numbered chart, did all these cutouts of bugs cut from paper and coded, and there are something like 25 prints of each, so this times 25. It's a lot of bug cutting. There's Ian with a heap of cut bugs. Thank you. Okay, that's working. Okay, so this is being run through the press. He's put down those right on the block. There's the paper that's going to go over it. This is at the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop. Oh, okay, so he's not going to lift it. Okay, so here was the annual Union Buddies visit at the Lake Mohegan House. You know, I used to think they were boring old men when they came, and I've really changed my mind since. So I wondered if they ever spoke about the old days when he threw acid on cloth in shops that were open 7 days a week. That's what he was doing on the fire escapes. And I didn't know about this until I visited. I went back there after doing work for The Nation on topics about labor. He was already very old, and he died shortly after that, but I mentioned it to him, and he got so excited talking about those days. And he said it was because it was unfair that people should work and not have a living wage. And he believed that firmly and strongly. And this is through the dissolution of the union and other things that, you know, I thought might have broken his heart, but I guess he was at peace with this, knowing that he did what he could to make things better. I thought it was funny reading a quote about Mark Cuban. I didn't really know anything about Mark Cuban, that he owned the Dallas Mavericks, and he was a shark investor on Shark Tank. But at some point, he shared profits with the workers who helped him succeed, saying, if I party, everybody parties, which was perfect for my grandfather, who was such a party person. Now, it's a small book that opens up, so that's him thinking about the old days. And here, the summer before last, my cousin Donnie and I decided to go back to see the house on Putnam Avenue in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where his father, our aunt, and my mother had grown up. And there is my mother. You see, it's 1934. She was born in 1921. She died when she was 96, like 2 years ago. But so seeing my mother in front of the house and the other family members, and then we posed in front of the house, really corny photos that I'll spare you. But the house looks pretty much the same, and the block is beautiful. So it was, you know, it made me imagine my mother coming down the steps and seeing me and me seeing her. So that's my own favorite picture in the bunch. And then these last pictures. So my grandfather put my mother's tea set that somebody had given her as a little girl away. And my mother never played with it. That's why it's in perfect shape upstairs, because she got it back maybe when she was 20 years old. And there's my grandfather's union clip that he wore when he didn't have like suspenders and a bow tie on. And my cousin Donnie's young daughter is now working with the graduate students union to fight for better conditions there, and she's got a position in that union now. So I think it's nice. Okay, that's it.